The wind howled like a banshee, a wild beast clawing at the mountainside. Snow, thick and relentless, whipped through the air, obscuring everything in a whiteout. It was the kind of storm that chilled you to the bone, even inside the relative safety of a moving vehicle. The old Jeep struggled forward, its headlights cutting through the swirling snow like feeble knives. Inside, 4 figures huddled together for warmth, their faces etched with worry. There was Sarah, the level-headed doctor, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to the chaos outside. Beside her sat Mark, a rugged outdoorsman, his eyes scanning the treacherous road ahead. In the back sat Emily, a young artist, her face pale with fear, and David, a cynical writer, his hand never far from the flask of whiskey he kept tucked in his coat pocket. They had been driving for hours, hoping to reach the small town on the other side of the mountain pass. But the storm, unexpected and brutal, had caught them off guard. Now lost and with night closing in, their situation was growing desperate. "We need to find shelter," Sarah said, her voice barely audible above the roar of the wind. "We can't survive the night out here." Mark nodded grimly, his eyes searching the roadside. There has to be something. A cabin, an overhang, anything. Just as despair began to set in, a faint light appeared through the driving snow, a flicker of yellow, weak but steady like a beacon in the storm. The cabin stood at the edge of a clearing, its silhouette barely discernible through the swirling snowflakes. The forest around it seemed to close in, as if guarding the secrets held within its wooden walls. Dark and imposing against the backdrop of the raging storm, the cabin seemed almost otherworldly. The wind howled through the trees, creating an eerie symphony that sent shivers down the spine. It looked ancient, almost swallowed by the snowdrifts that piled up against its walls. The weight of countless winters had left their mark, giving the structure an air of timelessness and mystery. A rickety wooden sign, barely visible under a thick layer of ice, proclaimed it to be Pinewood Cabin. The letters were faded but still legible, hinting at a history long forgotten. Hope surged through the weary travelers as Mark pulled the Jeep to a stop beside the cabin. The journey had been long and treacherous, and the sight of shelter brought a glimmer of relief to their tired eyes. It wasn't much, but it offered shelter from the deadly cold. The cabin stood as a beacon of hope amidst the relentless storm, a promise of warmth and safety. David, ever the cynic, grunted his skepticism. His eyes scanned the cabin warily, as if expecting it to vanish into thin air. "Looks like something out of a horror movie," he muttered, taking a swig from his flask. The unease in his voice was palpable, a stark contrast to the hope that had momentarily lifted their spirits. Ignoring him, Sarah and Mark approached the cabin, their boots crunching on the fresh snow. Each step brought them closer to the promise of warmth, a reprieve from the biting cold. The wooden door creaked open with a groan, revealing a dark and dusty interior. The air inside was thick with the scent of decay, mingling with the musty smell of old wood. The cabin was small, consisting of a single room dominated by a large stone fireplace. The hearth, though cold and empty, seemed to beckon them to light a fire and chase away the shadows. A rough-hewn table and chairs sat in the center, and a set of narrow bunks lined one wall. The furniture, though simple, spoke of a time when the cabin had been a refuge for weary souls. The air was stale and heavy, thick with the scent of decay and something else. Something vaguely unsettling. It was as if the cabin held memories of those who had sought shelter within its walls. "Hello?" Sarah called out, her voice echoing in the silence. The sound seemed to linger, amplifying the emptiness of the space. There was no reply, only the mournful howl of the wind outside. It was a reminder of the storm that raged beyond the fragile walls of their sanctuary. Despite the unsettling atmosphere, the travelers were grateful for the refuge. The cabin, eerie as it was, offered a chance to rest and regroup. They quickly set about making a fire, the warmth of the flames pushing back the chill that had seeped into their bones. The flickering light brought a semblance of normalcy to the otherwise eerie setting. As the fire crackled and hissed, casting flickering shadows across the cabin walls, they began to feel a sense of relief, a momentary reprieve from the deadly storm outside. The warmth wrapped around them like a comforting blanket, offering solace in the midst of chaos. As the storm raged outside, the wind howled through the trees, and the rain battered against the windows of the old cabin. Thunder roared in the distance, shaking the very foundation of the small wooden structure. Emily stumbled upon an old leather-bound journal, its cover worn and cracked from years of neglect. It was tucked beneath a pile of dusty blankets, hidden away as if it held secrets too dark to be revealed. Its pages were yellowed with age, each one fragile and delicate to the touch. The ink had faded but was still legible, telling a story that had been forgotten by time. "Look at this," she said, her voice hushed with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Her eyes scanned the first few lines, and she felt a chill run down her spine. The travelers gathered around the table, their faces illuminated by the flickering firelight. Each one was drawn to the journal as if it held a magnetic pull. The flickering firelight cast eerie shadows on the journal's aged pages, making the words dance and come alive. David, his usual cynicism momentarily forgotten, leaned closer, his eyes narrowing as he tried to make out the faded script. His eyes scanned the faded script, each word pulling him deeper into the past. The journal belonged to a man named Jedediah, a trapper who had sought shelter in the cabin over a century ago. His entries were filled with tales of the mountain, its unforgiving winters, and the strange occurrences that plagued him during his time in the cabin. The harsh winters were described in vivid detail, the cold seeping into his bones and the howling winds keeping him awake at night. And then there were the strange occurrences, the eerie sounds that echoed through the cabin, and the feeling of being watched. As David read aloud, his voice taking on a somber tone, the entries grew increasingly disturbing. Jedediah wrote of strange noises, whispers in the dead of night, and a growing sense of dread that permeated the cabin. The more he read, the more the sense of unease grew among the group. Each entry seemed to be a descent into madness, a chronicle of a man haunted by unseen forces. Jedediah wrote of strange noises, whispers in the dead of night, and a growing sense of dread that permeated the cabin. The whispers seemed to come from the very walls, as if the cabin itself was alive and aware of their presence. And with each passing night, the sense of dread grew stronger, wrapping around him like a suffocating shroud. "He says there's a presence here," David said, his voice barely a whisper. "A malevolent spirit trapped within these walls," Mark scoffed, shaking his head. "Ghost stories to scare children," he muttered. "Don't tell me you believe this nonsense." But there was a tension in the air, a palpable fear that none of them could shake. Even Mark, with his skepticism, couldn't completely dismiss the unease that had settled over the group. Sarah noticed the tremor in David's hand as he closed the journal, his knuckles white against the worn leather. She could see the fear in his eyes, a fear that mirrored her own. His knuckles were white against the worn leather, gripping the journal as if it were a lifeline. Jedediah's final entry, scrawled in a shaky hand, sent a chill down her spine. "It knows my name," Jedediah had written. "It's coming for me, and it won't rest until it claims the souls of all who enter this cursed place." The words seemed to echo in the silence of the cabin, a haunting reminder of the past that refused to be forgotten. Outside, the storm continued to rage, as if nature itself was warning them of the danger that lurked within the cabin's walls. The travelers exchanged uneasy glances, each one wondering if they too would fall victim to the whispers from the past. The storm raged on, a symphony of wind and snow, a relentless force of nature that seemed to have no end. The howling wind and swirling snowflakes created an almost surreal atmosphere, as if the world outside the cabin had been transformed into a frozen wasteland. That seemed to isolate the cabin from the rest of the world. Despite the warmth of the fire, a sense of unease settled over the travelers. Jedediah's words, filled with fear and desperation, hung heavy in the air. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows on the walls, but it did little to dispel the growing tension among the group. David, his cynicism replaced by a growing fear, paced the confines of the cabin, taking long swigs from his flask. His usual bravado had vanished, replaced by a palpable anxiety that gnawed at him. He muttered to himself, his eyes darting to the windows as if expecting some unseen horror to burst through at any moment. Emily huddled near the fire, her eyes wide with apprehension, her hands trembling as she clutched a blanket around her shoulders. She tried to draw comfort from the warmth, but the fear in her heart was like ice, cold and unyielding. While Sarah tried to maintain a semblance of calm, her medical training urging her to focus on the rationale. She took deep breaths, reminding herself to stay composed, but even she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Her mind raced with possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. Only Mark seemed unaffected by the journal's revelations. He dismissed it as the ramblings of a madman, but even his usually steady voice held a slight tremor, betraying his outward composure. He tried to rationalize the situation, but the unease in his eyes betrayed his true feelings. As night deepened, the storm reached its peak, the wind howling like a tormented beast. The cabin creaked and groaned under the relentless assault, and the travelers huddled closer together, their fear palpable. It was then that it happened. A sudden gust of wind slammed against the cabin, momentarily extinguishing the fire and plunging them into darkness. The sudden loss of light was disorienting, and for a moment all they could hear was the howling wind and their own panicked breaths. In the chaos that followed, a terrifying scream pierced the night. It was David's voice, filled with a raw terror that sent shivers down their spines. The scream was abruptly cut off, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Struggling to relight the fire, Sarah and Mark found David slumped against the wall, his eyes wide with fear, his body trembling. The flickering light revealed the horror of his condition, and they could see the terror etched into his features. His throat ripped open in a grotesque mockery of a smile. Blood stained his clothes and the wooden floor beneath him, a gruesome testament to the unseen force that had claimed him. The sight was almost too much to bear, and they recoiled in horror. Emily, her face white with terror, could only stare at the scene before her, her mind struggling to comprehend the horror that had unfolded in the space of a heartbeat. The reality of their situation began to sink in, and the true extent of the danger they faced became horrifyingly clear. Dust motes danced in the pale moonlight, filtering through grimy windows. The room, long abandoned, seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for something or someone to break the silence. The air was thick, almost tangible, with the weight of years gone by. Each particle of dust seemed to carry a story, a fragment of a forgotten past. The air hung heavy, thick with the smell of decay and forgotten knowledge. Shelves lined with books, their spines cracked and pages yellowed, stood as silent sentinels of a bygone era. The once grand library, now a shadow of its former self, whispered secrets to those who dared to listen. A lone figure silhouetted against the dim light stepped cautiously into the abandoned library. His footsteps echoed softly, a stark contrast to the oppressive silence that enveloped the room. Each step seemed to disturb the very fabric of time, as if the past and present were colliding in this forgotten place. Dr. Elias Stone, a man who dedicated his life to studying the past, found himself strangely drawn to this repository of forgotten stories. His eyes, sharp and inquisitive, scanned the room, taking in the layers of dust and decay. He had spent years chasing legends and myths, but something about this place felt different, more tangible. The floorboards groaned under his weight, each creak echoing through the silent building like a mournful cry. It was as if the very structure of the library was protesting his presence, warning him of the dangers that lay hidden within its walls. Yet he pressed on, driven by an insatiable curiosity. He ran a hand along a shelf, his fingers tracing the titles of books untouched for decades. Each book seemed to pulse with a life of its own, as if waiting for someone to unlock the secrets within. The titles, some faded beyond recognition, hinted at knowledge long forgotten, waiting to be rediscovered. An unsettling feeling crept up his spine. It was a sensation he couldn't quite place, a mix of fear and excitement. The air seemed to hum with an energy that was both alluring and terrifying. He knew he was on the brink of discovering something monumental, but at what cost? This was more than just an old library. It was a portal to another time, a place where the past and present coexisted in a delicate balance. The walls seemed to whisper, urging him to delve deeper, to uncover the truths that had been buried for so long. This place held secrets, whispered promises of things better left unknown. The cryptic symbols on the books hinted at knowledge that could change the course of history. Dr. Stone knew he had to proceed with caution, for the line between discovery and danger was perilously thin. Deep within the library's bowels, in a forgotten alcove hidden by shadows, Elias discovered a book unlike any he'd seen before. The library was a labyrinth of knowledge with towering shelves that seemed to stretch into infinity, filled with the wisdom of ages past. The air was thick with the scent of old parchment and the whispers of countless stories waiting to be told. As Elias wandered through the dimly lit aisles, his fingers brushed against the spines of countless volumes, each one a potential gateway to another world. But it was in a shadowy alcove, hidden from the casual observer, that he found it. The book was bound in ancient leather, its cover worn and cracked with age, yet it seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. Bound in ancient leather, its pages crackled with an unnatural energy. The title, etched in tarnished silver, sent a shiver down his spine. Chronicles of the Inevitable. Drawn by an unseen force, he opened the book, its pages unyielding at first, then falling open as if beckoning him closer. The title, Chronicles of the Inevitable, was etched in tarnished silver, and it sent a shiver down his spine. The letters seemed to glow faintly in the dim light, as if imbued with a life of their own. Elias felt a strange compulsion to delve deeper, to uncover the secrets hidden within its pages. Drawn by an unseen force, he opened the book, its pages unyielding at first, then falling open as if beckoning him closer. The first page depicted a scene eerily familiar, a chillingly accurate portrayal of a recent disaster he had read about in the news. The illustration was so detailed, so vivid, that it felt as though he were looking at a photograph rather than a drawing. The first page depicted a scene eerily familiar, a chillingly accurate portrayal of a recent disaster he had read about in the news. The image showed buildings crumbling, people fleeing in terror, and a sky darkened by smoke and ash. It was a scene of chaos and destruction, one that had played out in reality only days before. Unease twisted in his gut. This was no mere coincidence. The book held detailed accounts of events yet to come, each more unsettling than the last. As he turned the pages, he saw more scenes of devastation, each one more horrifying than the last. It was as if the book were a window into a future filled with darkness and despair. This was no mere coincidence. The book held detailed accounts of events yet to come, each more unsettling than the last. Elias felt a growing sense of dread as he realized the implications of what he was seeing. If the book's predictions were accurate, then the future was bleak indeed. The book held detailed accounts of events yet to come, each more unsettling than the last. The illustrations were hauntingly vivid, each one a testament to the horrors that awaited. Elias knew he had to find a way to prevent these events from coming to pass. But the question was, how? The answer, he hoped, lay somewhere within the pages of the Chronicles of the Inevitable. Panic welled in Elias's chest, a sensation so foreign yet so familiar. It was as if the very air around him had thickened, making it hard to breathe, hard to think. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the overwhelming dread that had taken hold of him, choking him with the undeniable truth. The truth that he had uncovered something far beyond his comprehension, something that could change the course of history forever. This book, this artifact of dread, held the key to future horrors, a macabre script of mankind's downfall. It wasn't just a relic of the past, it was a harbinger of what was to come. The pages whispered secrets of calamities that would befall humanity, each more terrifying than the last. He flipped through the pages, each one a punch to his gut, each illustration a grotesque masterpiece of impending doom, a global pandemic. The illustrations were vivid, almost alive, depicting scenes of suffering and chaos that seemed all too real. Cities crumbling under the weight of monstrous storms, the skies darkened with ominous clouds, and the winds howled like banshees, tearing apart everything in their path. The devastation was absolute, leaving nothing but ruins in its wake. Wars waged with terrifying weapons that defied logic. The technology was beyond anything he had ever seen, weapons that could obliterate entire armies in the blink of an eye. The battlefield was a nightmarish landscape of destruction and death. He had to tell someone, warn the world. But how could he convey the gravity of what he had discovered? How could he make them understand the urgency of the situation? His hands trembled as he reached for the phone, his mind racing with thoughts of who to call first. But who would believe him? The weight of his discovery pressed down on him, making him feel small and insignificant. He was just one man, a historian, not a prophet or a savior. The enormity of the task ahead seemed insurmountable. A madman's ramblings, they would say. They would dismiss him as a lunatic, someone who had lost touch with reality. The thought of being ridiculed and ostracized gnawed at him, but he knew he couldn't stay silent. The ravings of a historian who had delved too deep into the darkness. He had always been fascinated by the mysteries of the past, but this was different. This was a darkness that threatened to consume him, to pull him into an abyss from which there was no return. He felt a cold hand grip his heart, squeezing the hope out of him. The despair was overwhelming, a suffocating blanket that threatened to smother any glimmer of hope. But deep down, he knew he had to fight it. He had to find a way to warn the world, to make them see the truth before it was too late. Days turned into sleepless nights as Elias found himself drawn back to the library, his life now consumed by the grim prophecies within the book. He tried to forget, to convince himself it was all a bad dream, but the images were seared into his mind. Every news report, every flicker of unrest in the world mirrored the book's predictions with chilling accuracy. He was no longer a historian studying the past. He was a prisoner bound to the future, forced to watch as the world marched toward its inevitable doom. He was trapped in a story he couldn't rewrite, a puppet dancing to the strings of fate. The library, once a sanctuary of knowledge, transformed into a prison of his own making. The musty smell became suffocating, the silence a deafening symphony of dread. He became a ghost haunting the stacks, his eyes reflecting the horrors he'd witnessed within the book's pages. His reflection in the dusty windows no longer resembled the man he once was. The jovial glint in his eyes had been replaced with a chilling emptiness, the weight of the world crushing his spirit. He was a man broken by the future, a prisoner of time. Section 6. The eerie silence that speaks volumes. The silence of the library amplified his solitude. Each ticking second was a hammer blow to his sanity, a constant reminder of his powerlessness. He longed for the comfort of human interaction, for a voice other than the whispers of dread that echoed in his mind. Yet he dared not share his burden. To involve another soul would be to condemn them to the same fate, to trap them within this nightmare of preordained tragedy. So he remained silent, a solitary witness to the unraveling of the world. Section 7. A desperate attempt to rewrite destiny. Desperation gnawed at him. There had to be a way to break free, to change the course of events, to rewrite the future that was being forced upon him. He scoured the library for answers, hoping to find a counter-curse, a loophole, anything that would offer a glimmer of hope in the face of despair. But the library, once a source of comfort, now mocked him with its silence. The books, usually brimming with answers, offered no solace, only echoes of the horrors to come. His hope, once a flickering candle, dwindled with each passing moment. Section 8. Accepting the inescapable embrace of fate. Exhaustion, both physical and mental, finally claimed him. He collapsed amidst a mountain of books, their titles blurring into a sea of meaningless words. As he drifted into unconsciousness, he saw a vision of the future, not from the book, but from his own life. He saw himself old and broken, still trapped within the library's walls, his mind a wasteland of horrifying memories. It was then that he understood. There was no escape. His fate, like the words etched in that dreadful book, was sealed. Section 9. The haunting echoes of what could have been. He woke with the chilling realization that he was both prisoner and warden within his own personal hell. The library, his sanctuary, had become his tomb, a place where the echoes of the past whispered of a future he was powerless to change. He was left with nothing but time. Time to watch the world burn. Time to count the seconds until the prophecies he'd read came to pass. He was a ghost tethered to the mortal realm by the cruel hand of fate, forever haunted by the echoes of what could have been.
The fluorescent lights hummed above, casting a sickly yellow glow across the aisles. It was 2 a.m., the deadest part of the night shift at Good Foods, a grocery store that was anything but good. My name's Jack, and I'm stuck here with 2 other souls brave or stupid enough to work this graveyard shift. Sarah, a college student with nerves of steel, and Big Tony, a mountain of a man with a surprisingly soft heart. Tonight, the silence was broken only by the distant hum of refrigerators and the occasional thud of a product falling from a shelf. We were surrounded by towering shelves, stacked high with cans and boxes, each one a potential hiding place for something sinister. I could feel the sweat prickling on my skin despite the chill that clung to the air. "Did you hear that?" Sarah's voice cut through the silence, barely a whisper. She was staring down aisle 5, her eyes wide with apprehension. "Hear what?" Big Tony grumbled, his voice a low rumble that echoed through the empty aisles. He was busy restocking the dairy section, his massive frame dwarfed by the towering shelves. "I thought I heard something," Sarah said, her voice barely audible, like whispering. Big Tony snorted. "It's probably just the rats," he said. "This place is crawling with them." "Yeah, probably," Sarah said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Come on, Sarah," I said, forcing a chuckle. "You're letting your imagination run wild." She didn't look convinced, but she didn't argue either. She just nodded slowly and went back to restocking the cereal aisle. A sudden gust of wind slammed the back door shut with a deafening bang. The sound echoed through the store, making me jump. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest. It was just the wind, I told myself. Just the damn wind. What was that? Sarah exclaimed, her eyes wide with alarm. Just the wind, I said, trying to sound calm. It gets pretty strong around here. But even as I said it, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end, and a cold shiver ran down my spine. I glanced nervously towards the back of the store, where a set of rickety stairs led down into the basement. The basement. Nobody ever went down there. We all knew the stories, whispered amongst the employees like a forbidden secret, the stories of the old butcher shop that used to be down there, and the butcher who had vanished without a trace. The basement door creaked open slightly, as if beckoning us closer. My gaze lingered on that door, a knot of dread twisting in my gut. The flickering light beneath it seemed to pulse with a life of its own, casting grotesque shadows that danced across the grimy concrete floor. "You ever been down there?" Big Tony's question was gruff, his eyes fixed on the door as if daring it to move. "Nope," I muttered, shaking my head. "Nobody has, not for years, not since—" My voice trailed off, the unspoken words hanging heavy in the air. Sarah surprised us both. "What if we just took a peek?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "just to see what's down there?" Big Tony let out a low whistle. "You sure about that, Sarah? Those stories—" She shrugged, a nervous tremor running through her. "Someone's got to face the boogeyman, right?" Her words hung in the air, a challenge masked as a question. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the distant hum of the refrigerators. The air grew colder, the metallic tang stronger, as we crept down the creaking wooden stairs. Each step seemed to echo with the weight of untold years, the silence around us thick with anticipation. The single flickering bulb at the bottom of the stairs cast long, distorted shadows on the damp concrete walls, making the descent feel like a journey into the belly of a beast. "Man, this place is creepy," Big Tony muttered, his voice hushed in the oppressive silence. I could only nod, my heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. As we reached the bottom of the stairs, the basement unfolded before us, a cavernous space lost in shadow. The butcher shop was shrouded in a semi-darkness, the single bulb doing little to penetrate the oppressive gloom. Rusted hooks hung from the ceiling, their once sharp points dulled with time and neglect, but no less menacing. Below the hooks, the floor was a mosaic of cracked and discoloured tiles, stained with what could only be dried blood. A large walk-in freezer stood at the back, its metal door dented and rusted, a single word scrawled across it in what looked like dried blood. Beef. The sight of it sent a fresh wave of nausea rolling through me, and I had to fight the urge to turn and run back up the stairs. "This is messed up," Big Tony muttered, his usually jovial face grim. The air hung heavy, thick with the stench of rot and decay. I ran a hand along the cold, damp wall, my fingers tracing the outline of what felt like a handprint etched into the grime. But this was no ordinary handprint. It was too large, the fingers splayed at an unnatural angle, as if seared into the brick by a force beyond human comprehension. "What the hell happened here?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Her usually bright eyes were wide with apprehension, reflecting the faint, sickly glow emanating from the single bulb overhead. Big Tony, his face pale beneath his thick beard, just shook his head, unable to voice the horror that clawed at the edges of our reality. We stood there for a moment, three souls adrift in a sea of darkness, the silence punctuated only by the drip, drip, drip of water from a broken pipe in the corner. I forced myself to move, drawn deeper into the butcher shop's macabre embrace. The floor was a minefield of debris, rusted cleavers, shattered bones that crunched underfoot, and chunks of something that looked suspiciously like dried flesh. This wasn't just a butcher shop, it was a slaughterhouse. My gaze fell on the walk-in freezer. The metal door hung slightly ajar, a black maw that promised only darkness and despair. A cold gust of air, heavy with the stench of decay, seeped out, sending a fresh wave of nausea through me. "Don't even think about it, Jack," Sarah said, her voice tight with apprehension. She knew me too well, but curiosity, like a hungry beast, gnawed at my insides. I had to see what was inside. I had to know what secrets this frozen tomb held. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the heavy door open. The stench that hit me was overwhelming, a putrid mix of rotting meat and something else, something sickly sweet and altogether wrong. I fumbled for the light switch, my heart pounding against my ribs like a drum. The flickering bulb did little to illuminate the horrors within. Hooks, dozens of them, hung from the ceiling, each one empty. But the floor was a charnel house. These weren't the neatly butchered cuts of beef or pork I was used to seeing. These were dismembered, twisted, profane, limbs contorted at unnatural angles, some impossibly large, others grotesquely small. Faces frozen in silent screams stared up at me from the macabre buffet. A wave of dizziness washed over me and I stumbled back, bile rising in my throat. The metallic tang of blood, thick and cloying, filled the air, mingling with the stench of decay and something else, something acrid, like burning hair and sulphur. It was the smell of death, but not a death I could comprehend. "Jack, get out of there!" Sarah's voice, sharp with urgency, cut through the haze of horror that had descended upon me. I wanted to. God, how I wanted to. But my feet were rooted to the spot, frozen in place by the sheer terror of what I was witnessing. This wasn't the work of a man. No man could have done this. This was something else, something evil. These weren't animals, these were people. A low groan echoed through the freezer, a sound that seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end, and a cold shiver, one that had nothing to do with the frigid temperature, ran down my spine. I could feel eyes on me, watching, studying me from the darkness. I was prey, trapped in a cage of my own morbid curiosity. And then I heard it, a soft, wet chuckle. It came from the back of the freezer, from the deepest shadows where the light couldn't reach. The chuckle grew louder, morphing into a low, guttural laugh that seemed to shake the very foundation of the building. Panic seized me, cold and sharp. I had to get out, now! As I turned to flee, the freezer door slammed shut with a deafening clang, plunging me into darkness. I hammered on the metal, my screams swallowed by the thick, insulated walls. I was trapped, and then through the darkness I heard a voice. "Welcome," the voice rasped, each word dripping with malice, "to my special kitchen." The metallic clang of the freezer door reverberated through the room, the sound echoing my own fear. Blackness, absolute and suffocating, descended. The stench of rot intensified. A suffocating miasma that clung to my skin invaded my nostrils, tasted like bile in the back of my throat. I fumbled for the door handle, my fingers slipping on the frost-covered metal. Panic swelled in my chest, a suffocating pressure that made it hard to breathe. "Sarah! Tony!" I roared, my voice lost in the suffocating darkness. Then a faint light flickered at the back of the freezer, pushing back the oppressive darkness. It wasn't the harsh glare of a light bulb, but a soft, pulsing glow, like the embers of a dying fire. It cast long, grotesque shadows that danced across the walls, taking on the shape of monstrous creatures and writhing human forms. As my eyes adjusted, I realized the light was emanating from the meat, from the mounds of flesh that littered the floor. And then I saw him. He stood at the back of the freezer, a hulking silhouette backlit by the eerie glow. He wore a blood-soaked apron that hung from his massive frame like a shroud, and a heavy cleaver glinted in his hand, catching the sickly light. A low, guttural sound emanated from him, a sound that was both a growl and a sigh. It seemed to vibrate in my chest, resonating deep within my bones. "Foolish mortals," he rasped, his voice a dry, scraping sound like bones grinding together. "You dare intrude upon my domain?" His words were slow, deliberate, thick with an accent I couldn't quite place. But it was the tone that chilled me to the core, a voice that spoke of ancient evils and unspeakable appetites. The air crackled with an unseen energy, a palpable sense of dread that pressed down on me, stealing the air from my lungs. I tried to speak, to apologize, to plead for my life, but the words wouldn't come. My throat was constricted, my voice a strangled whisper lost in the cavernous space. "You seek answers," the butcher continued, his voice a low rumble that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. "You seek to understand the darkness that dwells within these walls." He chuckled, a dry, rattling sound that echoed through the freezer. "Then look around you, mortal, and despair." My gaze darted around the freezer, taking in the full horror of my surroundings. The once innocuous mounds of meat now appeared grotesque, monstrous. I could see faces contorted in silent screams, limbs twisted at unnatural angles, eyes staring accusingly from beneath layers of glistening fat. The butcher took a step closer, the floor groaning beneath his weight. The cleaver in his hand glinted under the eerie green glow, its edge reflecting the gruesome tableau around us. It wasn't a butcher's cleaver, not anymore. It was a tool of something else, something ancient and evil. The smell was overwhelming now, a sickening blend of rot, blood, and something else, something acrid and metallic like the smell of burning flesh. It clung to the back of my throat, choking me, forcing me to breathe through my mouth, each inhale a fresh wave of nausea. He was toying with me, savoring my fear. And as I stared at the hulking figure before me, at the cleaver dripping with some unknown ichor, a single terrifying thought pierced the fog of my terror. I wasn't going to die quickly. "You see, boy," the butcher rasped, his voice a low rumble that seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves. "This town has a hunger, an insatiable hunger. They come to me seeking to sate their appetites, to indulge in their darkest desires. His words were like venom seeping into my mind, poisoning my thoughts. But I was paralyzed, frozen in place by a fear so profound it transcended the physical. He let out a low chuckle that sent chills down my spine. Fools. Their flesh, their bones, their very souls. They all belong to me now. The cleaver flashed in the sickly green light, a silver arc against the darkness. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing myself for the inevitable. But the blow never came. Instead, I heard a sickening thud, followed by a gurgling scream, a scream that was cut short, ending in a wet gasp. I opened my eyes, my heart pounding against my ribs like a wild animal trying to escape its cage. The butcher stood frozen, the cleaver raised above his head. But it wasn't me he was looking at. Sarah stood in the open doorway, her face pale but determined. In her hands she held a fire axe, its blade buried deep in the back of a shadowy figure that had been concealed behind a stack of meat. The figure slumped to the ground, revealing a grotesque, inhuman creature with razor-sharp claws and eyes that glowed with an unholy light. "What the—" I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. "Don't just stand there, you idiot!" Sarah shouted, her voice shaking but firm. "Help me with this thing!" The butcher roared in anger, a sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. He turned towards Sarah, his massive form blocking the doorway, the cleaver raised high. But before he could strike, another figure lunged from the shadows. Big Tony, his face a mask of rage, slammed into the butcher with the force of a runaway train. The impact sent both of them crashing to the ground, the cleaver clattering across the floor, skidding to a stop at my feet. "Jack!" Sarah screamed, her voice hoarse with exertion. "The axe!" I scrambled toward the fallen axe, my fingers closing around the cold, rough handle. It was heavier than I expected, the wood slick with grime and something else, something warm and sticky. I didn't want to know what it was. Adrenaline surged through me, overriding the fear that threatened to consume me. I hefted the axe, feeling its weight in my hands, a strange sense of power coursing through me. This was it, fight or die. The butcher roared again, the sound primal, filled with rage and pain. He flung Big Tony aside like a rag doll, sending him crashing into a shelf with a sickening crunch. Tony lay still, his massive frame unnaturally twisted. I couldn't hesitate. I wouldn't. Summoning every ounce of strength I had left, I charged forward, the axe held high above my head. The butcher turned, his eyes glowing red in the dim light, fixed on me. For a moment our gazes locked, and I saw a flicker of something in those depths, something ancient and cruel, something that saw me not as a threat but as a plaything. And then, with a roar that ripped from my throat, I brought the axe down on the butcher's arm. The sound of metal biting into flesh, the sickening crunch of bone, echoed through the freezer. The butcher screamed, a high-pitched shriek of pain and rage that was abruptly cut short. He stumbled back, clutching his severed arm, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Let's go!" Sarah screamed, pulling me towards the open doorway. I didn't need to be told twice. We scrambled out of the freezer, past the fallen form of the creature Sarah had killed, past the still twitching body of Big Tony. The butcher's screams followed us up the stairs, echoing through the empty store, a chilling soundtrack to our escape. We didn't stop running until we were outside, the cool night air stinging our lungs, the distant city lights a beacon of normalcy in the face of the horrors we had witnessed. As the sun began to rise, casting long shadows across the parking lot, we looked back at the grocery store, its familiar facade now sinister and foreboding. We knew deep down that we would never be the same. We had looked into the abyss, and the abyss had looked back, and in those depths we had seen a hunger that could never be sated. The first tendrils of dawn painted the sky a bruised purple, a stark contrast to the sickly yellow glow of the good food sign. We stood there, Sarah and I, shivering in the cold morning air, our clothes stained with blood and grime. The silence was shattered by distant sirens, a perverse comfort, a reminder that the world outside still existed. "They'll never believe us," Sarah whispered, her eyes fixed on the approaching lights. Our story sounded like the ravings of madmen. The first police car screeched to a halt in front of the store, followed closely by another, and then an ambulance uniformed figures poured out, their shadows stretching in the growing light. We told them everything, or at least we tried to. The words stumbled out, disjointed and fragmented. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, their skepticism evident. They found Big Tony's body in the freezer, broken and twisted. They found the remains of the creature Sarah had killed, but they didn't find the butcher. And they never would. Some secrets are best left buried, hidden in the shadows. Life, as it always does, went on. The grocery store remained closed, cordoned off with yellow tape, a silent sentinel to the horrors that had unfolded within its walls. Rumors spread like wildfire, whispered in hushed tones, fueled by fear and speculation. But the truth, the real truth, remained buried deep, known only to Sarah and me. We tried to move on, to forget. But the memories lingered, etched into our minds like scars on our souls. The stench of rot, the feel of cold metal against our skin, the butcher's voice, a rasping whisper in our nightmares. We never spoke of that night again, but the memory bound us together, a shared trauma that forged an unbreakable bond. We had faced the darkness together, and in a strange way, it had made us stronger. But we both knew deep down that a part of us would forever be trapped in that basement, in the butcher's domain, a chilling reminder of the monsters that lurk beneath the surface of our everyday lives. We had been lucky to escape with our lives, but we would never be the same. The Good Foods grocery store never reopened. It stood there, abandoned and forgotten, a decaying testament to the darkness that lurked beneath its seemingly mundane facade. And somewhere, in the shadows, in the spaces between reality and nightmare, the butcher was waiting. Waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to stumble upon his domain. Waiting to feed his insatiable hunger. The end.